Arrakis, Dune, Desert Planet. The Zensuni wanderers speak of a world covered in sand, where giant worms swam in the desert like sharks from ancient Terra. A world that was once the only place in the known universe where you could harvest spice melange, the great drug that extends life and makes it possible to fold space. It was here on Arrakis that many different food and drink found their origins, including today's dish, Tabara root cake, a sweet honey cake made with Tabara root mixed with honey and spice. And while I don't have any Tabara root or spice melange, I think we can make a pretty good substitute here at Dakon's Bakehouse. When I started working on this recipe, I found several Tabara root recipes that had been adapted by others already online. However, when testing them, I ran into several issues. The biggest one being the density of the cake. In my initial trials, the dish came out with a consistency similar to a pie. It was still good, it just felt dense and looked underbaked, despite being fully cooked. Tabara root cake is one of the few food dishes mentioned in the Dune books, and it's actually only mentioned in the Dune Encyclopedia. None of the novels really talk about food other than to say that most food is cooked with spice melange. Wines and beers are mentioned in great detail, but food is kept pretty generic. However, the Dune Encyclopedia describes Tabara root cake as a sweet honey cake of heavy consistency, a mixture of cooked and mashed Tabara root, honey, and spice pressed into a dish. It was then sprinkled with dried seeds and crystallized fruit. It was served in small triangular portions with fresh fruit and hot spiced coffee. With this description, I had more of a coffee cake in mind. So I started digging through various Middle Eastern recipes to find anything similar and blended a few of them together to get my own version of Tabara root cake. For this recipe, you're going to need 1 medium sweet potato or taro root. This acts as our Tabara root. Ultimately, you'll be using 1 cup or about 156 grams of mashed sweet potato or taro root, 1 3/4 cup or 272 grams of flour, 1/2 a teaspoon or 3 grams of salt, 1/2 a teaspoon or 2.3 grams of baking soda, 1 teaspoon or 4.4 grams of baking powder, 2 tablespoons or 17 grams of spice blend. Now, I used a mixture of cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and cardamom. I'll go over the exact measurements of the mixture in just a bit. 1 teaspoon or 5 milliliters of vanilla, 1/2 a cup or 237 milliliters of milk, 1/4 a cup or 59 milliliters of honey, 2 eggs, and 1 cup or 236 milligrams of brown sugar split in half. You will use half in the cake and half later in the recipe. You can use any type of brown sugar, but I used dark brown sugar because I wanted more molasses and more of that richer, darker, nuttier flavor. 1/2 a cup or 108 grams of butter. I use salted butter, but unsalted works just as well. You're also going to need various nuts, seeds, and dried fruits based on your personal preference. I used almonds, pistachios, dried cranberries, dried dates, and dried figs. I think fresh figs would have been better, but they're out of season over here right now, so I just wasn't able to get any. First, we'll preheat our oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 176 degrees Celsius. Now, let's start with the Tabara root. Obviously, this doesn't exist in the real world, so we need some sort of analog. Now, I use sweet potato, but if you can find a taro root, that will also work really well and give a kind of nutty flavor to the dish. Peel and chop your sweet potato. The smaller you chop it, the faster it will cook. Heat up a pot of water to boiling and add the chopped sweet potato. This should take about 10 minutes or so to cook. You want the sweet potato to fall apart when you stab it with a fork, as we'll be mashing it up, and you don't want any of it to be tough. While that's cooking, let's mix up our spice blend. Unfortunately, this spice blend won't give you hallucinations, it won't extend your life, and it won't let you see the future. But it does taste pretty good. Also, I would like to say that the cardamom here is optional. Cardamom can get pretty expensive and you're not going to use much of it. So if you want to skip it, go right ahead. Now for this spice blend, we're going to mix together 1.5 teaspoons or 4.5 grams of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon or 3 grams of dried ginger, half a teaspoon or 1.5 grams of cloves, half a teaspoon or 1.5 grams of nutmeg, and 1/4 of a teaspoon or 750 milligrams of cardamom. Once blended, set that aside for later. Next, let's take a look at your nuts, seeds, and dried fruits. It's a good idea to give any nuts a rough chop or put them in a food processor for a couple of pulses. For your fruits, I recommend you give them a rough chop as well. And if you want them to be decorative and pretty, cut the figs into discs. Set the figs aside and keep them separate from the rest of the nuts and fruits. Grab a 1/2 cup of brown sugar and mix that in with the nut and fruit mixture. Make sure the nuts, seeds, and fruits are well coated in the brown sugar. Set them aside for later. At this point, your sweet potato should be cooked. Drain the water out and mash the sweet potato until it is of a fine consistency. If you have a food processor, I recommend using that to puree the sweet potato. Once pureed, portion out 1 cup or about 156 grams of the mash into a mixing bowl. Add the vanilla, milk, honey, eggs, and the remaining brown sugar to the sweet potato bowl and stir it all together until fully blended. In a separate bowl, whisk together the flour, salt, baking soda, baking powder, and the spice blend. Combine both bowls together. If you have a stand mixer, place the sweet potato mixture into the stand mixer bowl and then slowly add the flour to the spice mixture. If you don't have a stand mixer, just combine the two mixtures into a single bowl and stir until blended. The entire process should only take a couple of minutes. Now, this next step can vary a bit depending on your equipment. If you have an 8-inch or 20 centimeter pie pan, you'll want to butter up the sides and the base of the pan. This will grease up the pan, making it easier to get the cake out of the pan when you're done baking it. I happen to have a cast iron skillet of similar size. Because cast iron cooks very evenly and cleans nicely, I decided to use that. I took the entire 1/2 cup of butter and melted it into the cast iron. If you don't have a cast iron, take a sec to melt the butter in the microwave or on the stove, and then pour the butter into your pie pan. Place down the figs at the bottom of the pan and let them get coated with the butter. Then pour in the nut and fruit mixture and spread that out to create an even layer of butter, sugar, nuts, and fruit. Pour the cake batter over the top and spread it out evenly onto the pan. Place that in the oven and bake for about 35 to 40 minutes, or until your toothpick comes back clean when you check the center. I ran out of toothpicks and used a butter knife. I also recommend putting a cookie sheet under the pan as sometimes the butter can bubble up and over and cause a lot of smoke. And if you can catch that in the pan before it hits the bottom of your oven, you can prevent the smoke. Now, while the cake is in the oven, let's talk a bit about the Dune franchise. No, not the books or the movies, but instead, we're going to focus on the often overlooked games that made up the Dune universe. The first Dune game was made in 1992 and was an interactive point-and-click adventure story following the book's plot, but with artwork reminiscent of the 1984 movie made by David Lynch. It was a rather complex game for its time, and it still holds up even today. A unique game with awesome pixel art and killer music, Dune is still a fun game to play. Dune 2, released also in 1992 by Westwood Studios, changed the face of RTS gaming. While it's not the first real-time strategy game ever made, it is the first to establish the formula used in all RTS games today. And it served as inspiration for all major real-time strategy games that followed it in the 90s. Westwood Studios would go on to create the Command and Conquer series. And Dune 2 also heavily influenced the development of the first Warcraft game. Without Warcraft, we wouldn't have Dota or League of Legends. Without Dune 2, we wouldn't have Warcraft. Dune 2, despite being a largely forgotten game today, was massively influential in shaping the landscape of modern gaming. But that influence was not to last. Several Dune games and ports were created after Dune 2 over the next decade, and with one exception, they all fell flat. That exception would be Emperor: Battle for Dune. This was the last Dune game made by Westwood Studios. This real-time strategy would take everything that was good about the genre at the time and put it into a single game. Updated graphics, campy dialogue with motion-captured acting, and a pretty killer soundtrack. Battle for Dune's gameplay also included everything that players expected from a real-time strategy during that era. Unfortunately, all these old games have been largely abandoned, and playing them now is difficult, if not impossible, for some of the games. You can still find ports of Dune and Dune 2, but Battle for Dune will only play if you have legacy PC hardware from the early 2000s. The Dune franchise would languish in obscurity for over 20 years. This is largely because the estate for Frank Herbert, Dune's author, doesn't really appear to place any major value on licensing of just games alone. From what little I've managed to glean from the internet, and, take this with a little grain of salt, it seems that the estate prefers to kind of package up game licensing as part of a media rights licensing that goes along with movies. This is why all the Dune games made in the 90s are based off of the Dune movie from 1984. Without a movie going along with it, publishers struggle to get licensing permission for more Dune games. And all of that changed, however, in 2021 with the coming of Denis Villeneuve's masterpiece interpretation of Dune. New media licenses opened the doors for Funcom, who built and released a brand new Dune RTS game called Dune Spice Wars in 2023. Similar to Dune 2 and Battle for Dune, Spice Wars lets you play as one of several factions vying for dominance of Arrakis and control over spice production. While it's not a game changer for the franchise, if you were a fan of the early Dune real-time strategy games, you will find a lot to enjoy in Spice Wars. It takes everything you loved about the older Dune RTS games and builds a modern shell around it with all the quality of life upgrades that 2 decades of gaming advancement brings. I loved Spice Wars and will probably be playing it for years to come. But Spice Wars is not the only game Funcom made for Dune. Just a few weeks ago came the release of Dune Awakening, a massive multiplayer online survival game. This is by far the most ambitious Dune game to be released. Dune Awakening places you directly in the middle of the action. Using an alternate reality to the main storyline, Dune Awakening sets you on a mission to find the Fremen. During this mission, you scour the sands of Arrakis, fighting off scavengers, smugglers, and rivals from opposing houses. Since the game is a survival game, you have to deal with heat, travel at night, avoid sandworms, and find and filter water just to stay alive. And it is here that we take a moment to check on our Tabara root cake, because it should be ready by now. Just in time, too, as my hunger meter is starting to get a little low. Once the cake comes out of the oven, you want to let it rest for about 10 minutes. The cake needs to be warm, but not fresh out of the oven hot for the next step. Once it's rested, place a plate or some other flat item, in my case I used a cutting board, over the cake pan and then flip it upside down, just like you would with a pineapple upside down cake. If everything goes right, you'll end up with a spiced cake topped with caramelized fruit and nuts. And here it is, Tabara root cake. The perfect treat for relaxing in the sweltering heat of the Arakeen sun. Let me know in the comments if you try making this for yourself and how the flipping part goes, because I know sometimes that can get a little dicey. And be sure to hit that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the delicious treats that we make here at Dakon's Bakehouse. All right, and here we go with Tabara root cake from Dune. Make sure I get a good amount of the nuts and fruits. Takes it a second. Those spices are subtle, but God, they're good. It's like a pumpkin pie, but in cake form. And the brown sugar and the fruit on the top. Oh yeah. This is really good. Okay, I'm gonna go finish this whole thing, and you guys can just hit like and subscribe, and you're definitely gonna want to make this yourself, because this is really good.